Mark P. Otten back with you.
Okay, so this is your lesson on item parceling. This is a technique that I used for my dissertation and um, has served me well in the past as a possible solution for okay, so I don't have quite enough sample size to support a full structural equation model, but I also don't want to just make composites of all of my scales, because if I make composites, then that's like just an average, and then it completely removes the latent variable potential, the value of making factors, right? Because if you make a factor, you've got those factor loadings that compose a latent variable that is better defined in some ways than just a composite, right? Because those factor loadings are unequal to each other. It allows the variable to gain some meaning and to better define itself. So anyway, item parceling is a way of still doing some factoring, some creation of latent variables without involving every single item. And so it does serve as a compromise between a full SEM and then just converting all of your latent variables to composites to form, let's say, a path analysis. So how is this compromise put together? That is the topic of this video. First, a few words about my dissertation. So this was what I used in the dissertation, this item parceling stuff, and it's because I had 201 participants and I had a huge model, lots of questionnaires, and a number of those questionnaires were well defined by the literature, but some of them were not, and so that's the other decision here. It's like, well, if you have a new scale or something that has not been factor analyzed in the literature before, you probably will have some, there will be some value in factoring it or making it into a latent variable so that you can define it, and there might be some empirical value there. So anyway, I had some scales that would have benefited from that analysis, turning those variables into latent ones. So I wanted to keep some of them as latent variables, but I only had 201 participants, and I had a lot of hypotheses and a lot of variables. One thing I did was I had pre-test and post-test, so a lot of the times for these scales I could make I could do a factor analysis at pre-test and then use the results to then inform my post-test factor structure, meaning that, okay, let's say I factor analyze this one scale, it was one factor at pre-test, well then I can make a composite theoretically at post-test of all of those items because they all had strong factor loadings at pretest. So that was one thing that I was able to do, but then again, I'm just a mediocre researcher. So let me move on. Okay, so this is what I was talking about with factor analyzing at pretest and then inserting the post-test measure into the SEM. But I did end up with 8 latent variables, so even doing this, I still had 8 latent variables at post-test, and so I had a lot of decisions to be made regarding those. So this is what one portion of the model looked like. This was just the anxiety portion. And so I had somatic cognitive and self-confidence, somatic cognitive anxiety and self-confidence. The correlations between them were hypothesized to be there. One of them dropped out between somatic anxiety and self-confidence. That was by the Wald test. But you see, overall, we have a pretty solid model here with some good factor loadings for each of these scales. There were a couple of cross loadings that I did add. But this is already a ton of parameters, and with 201 participants, I'm already pushing it to include anything else besides this, these items here. And so then we might be tempted to just make 3 variables here: one for somatic as a composite, one for cognitive as a composite, and one for self-confidence as a composite. So that was the temptation. Then we move forward with self-focus, which was less well-defined. The CFI for this one was only 0.75, so item 2 we dropped out. Items 5 and 10 were kind of weak. So this one was not as well-defined, but it was important to admit that and report that so that we could define self-focus better. Maybe we just select 1 or 2 of the items by themselves and define it that way. Self-focus is thought to be a bad thing for performance if you're focusing too much on yourself. Let's say the body movement associated with shooting a basketball free throw. If you're focused too much on it explicitly, then that's a bad thing. Anyway, so this is an important variable to define as well. So this was where it fit in the train of hypotheses here. From left to right, we had sort of like the things on the left were the things that came first, hypothetically, by the hypothesis, and that was sport confidence and reinvestment of attention, which was like how much you tend to ruminate, how much you tend to think too much. That's reinvesting attention in what you're doing, in this case, sport performance. So those things you kind of like come in with as part of your personality, theoretically, and then you are presented with an experimental manipulation, which is, in this case, was a pressure performance task under the bright lights of a video camera that we brought in. So you're presented with the manipulation, the pressure task, then you feel these things. You feel confident, if you're well prepared, that is, feeling confident and not feeling anxious. Then those feelings then translate to behavior, so ultimately performance there, and then we had a bunch of like mediators. So self-focus was thought of as a mediator between anxiety and performance. And then use of implicit knowledge and intuition was hypothesized to be a positive thing. Use of explicit knowledge, a negative thing. So if we're translating this to, let's say, just giving a public speech, you want to not be too focused on the words that you're saying and the gestures that you're making. That would be explicit kind of monitoring of yourself. You don't want that. You want to just sort of feel like you're confident, and you just, if you have intuitive control, you just know it's going to go well. You're not sure why, but you're just super relaxed. And so that's what this set of hypotheses is implying, and was implying for my set of hypotheses here. So statistically, we had a mess because we had 201 people, all these latent variables, and then all these latent variables then were composed of measured variables, and so we had 74 measured variables, which is like more than 1/3 the size of the sample, right? 74 out of 201. So really, we had too many things that we were measuring, so we needed to cut it down. But I didn't want to cut out hypotheses. I wanted to cut out measurement, and so the way to do that ended up being item parceling. We could calculate the degrees of freedom. That's a pretty ridiculous calculation, though. The solution I should get to, and that is item parceling. So, like I said, it's a compromise. It was originally written about by Kishton and Wideman in the 90s. I'm pretty sure it came before them, but you can go back to their publication and see who they referred to. But they set out sort of the guidelines of how to do this. You keep your SEM as it is. So if you go back to here, we're going to keep this model as it is, but we're going to cut down on, for example, self-confidence, or I'm sorry, sport confidence over there on the left. Had 22 items on the questionnaire. We need to cut those down. And so theoretically then, if we just made composites of each of these latent variables, we would have, what is that, 8 latent variables, so 8 composites, plus 2 more, 10 total variables. That seems doable, much more doable with 201 participants than would one with 74 measured variables. So the compromise that I keep alluding to is to divide a scale into subsets of items. So there's 3 different ways to do this as proposed by these authors, and so I'll show you them in turn. Each of the subsets is summed or averaged together to create a composite. So we're not compositing the whole scale, we're compositing subsets of the scale, and then those subsets are going to compose a latent variable. And so we're keeping these things as latent variables, but we're reducing the number of items that go into each one. And so here's the first way to do it, just random assignment. So suppose you have 22 items on a questionnaire. You go first 7 items, second 7 items, and last 8 items, right? And you just create 3 composites, and then you have those 3 composites assemble to be the indicators of a single latent variable. So so long as all of the original item loadings were high, you should be good to go. So for me, I did some, like I said, pre-test factor analyses, determined that items were all generally high, let's say for that sport confidence questionnaire, and then I felt justified to do random assignment here to the different parcels. So again, for that one I took 22 items, averaged together the first 7, or I guess the 7 randomly selected items, the next 7 randomly selected items, and then 8 more randomly selected items, and then made 3 composites, and then each of those composites had their own factor loadings to compose a new latent variable with just 3 indicators as opposed to 22. The second method is just to make sure that each particular parcel or composite is well defined enough such that at least one of the highest loadings is included in each of those parcels. Meaning, like, okay, you take 7 randomly selected items out of the 22, but let's say those 7 that you randomly selected were all some of the lowest loadings. Well, then that particular parcel is going to load poorly onto the factor itself because it's composed of a bunch of poor loading items. So this is just sort of a something useful to preserve the quality of the latent variable in the quality of the factor loadings. So what you could do here is you could kind of like do a factor analysis, rank order your factor loadings, and then make sure that at least each composite has at least 1 or 2 high ones included in its parcel. This one, to me, is I guess, I don't know, it's a little bit like fishing through your factor loadings. It's a little bit not, but to me it's like, well, we might as well randomly select, and then that's okay, I think, typically. You could, again, refer back to Kishton and Wideman for more wisdom on this, but I would probably stick with number 1 typically, and not hunt for high factor loadings, because when you do that you might get a little bit of skepticism back from reviewers of your item parceled solution. So far I would stick with number 1. However, number 3 I think is usually recommended if you have some theory to guide it. So this is good by the scientific method, because whenever you have theory to guide something, that is a nice thing that allows you to stick with the usual, well, okay, let's make a theory, a hypothesis, and then let it inform our analysis decisions. So the theory or hypothesis here is just that, let's say, okay, so I had my reinvestment scale, which I mentioned before. It was composed of different subscales within it. It was hypothesized as one factor, however. So in hypothesizing it as one factor, we're ignoring the subscales, but we can kind of bring the subscales back because we're item parceling, and that is useful in this sense. So the reinvestment scale, there was some public self-consciousness items in there. There were also some rehearsal, which is like what's the rumination kind of stuff, thinking too much, and which is a bad thing for preparing in sports, typically, to perform under pressure. But anyway, there were these subscales, so you can let the subscales be the parcels, and so you can composite your subscales to compose still a latent variable through the item parceling process, but let your theory, your previously composed subscales, be your parcels. And I think that if this is an option, if there is some theory to guide you into thinking that you can split up your scale in some way by these sections, then I would go ahead and do this. So number 3 is sort of recommended by default, but then if you don't have subscales within your factors, then go back to number 1, I think is probably the usual recommendation. All right, so what did I do? Well, I had these, like I said, 74 measured variables. The sport confidence and reinvestment scales in particular were way too long and out of control. So I went ahead and ran this by Peter Bentler at the time, who was my advisor. He recommended item parceling. I had never heard of it. I went ahead and looked into it and made a bunch of parcels, and I pretty much parceled everything that I could because I wanted to get all of my latent variables down to either 3 or 4 indicators, and so I even parceled the ones that had 7 and 9 items, as you see there. So starting with sport confidence, I used parceling method number 2. This one was So I did a factor analysis on the 22 items. There were some subscales that were originally thought to be in there, but the factor analysis was screaming at me, hey, just make one factor. Like the eigenvalue was just like way out of control. I did an EFA, an exploratory factor analysis, to determine that one factor was just like really the thing for this sport confidence scale. So I was like, okay, let me keep it as one factor, and then since all the loadings are pretty high, I'm just going to randomly assign. And then it says parceling method number 2. I did a little bit of double checking at the end. Number 2 was this one to make sure that high loadings are evenly distributed across the parcels. I didn't really have to do that. I could have just stuck with random assignment, as I recall, but I went ahead and on Peter's recommendation, recommended that he recommended that that I go ahead and make sure that at least one or more items on each factor, or on each parcel, that is, had high factor loadings. So I did that. That was the only time I used number 2. For the reinvestment scale, there were 14 items originally and 2 subscales, as I recall, which I mentioned on the slide. There was public self-consciousness and rehearsal. So what I did was I split my scale into 2, which was those 2 subscales, and then two parcels is not really enough to create a latent variable, so I then split each of those parcels in half randomly. And so that's why it says number 3, then number 1. I used method 3 to split into 2 parcels, and then I used random assignment to split those 2 each in half. So I ended up with 4 parcels there for reinvestment. Everything else was random. Number 1, randomly splitting up my items. So for the self-confidence scale, there were 5 items. I made 3 parcels. It was like 2 items, 2 items, and 1 item. So it was very close to just leaving. I was very close to leaving it as 5 items, but we were concerned that reviewers might be skeptical of such a large model, so many measured variables with such a small sample, that we wanted to convert it down, or item parcel it down as much as we could. So that's what we did there. For the remainder of scales, we just did some random assignment. So got it down to 27 measured variables instead of 74, which is better. Still probably too big for 201 participants, but again, it was the best we could do, and ultimately this study was published somehow. So anyway, we could recalculate degrees of freedom here for still a pretty ridiculous model. But we'll let that, you guys can practice that on your own if you'd like to refresh your degrees of freedom calculation skills. But let me just show you the final solution here. Ultimately, so this was the sport confidence scale with extremely high factor loadings, and those are your item parcels. So the first item parcel there was like an average of items 2, 5, 10, 12, 16, 19, and 22, and you can see the other 2 are also averages. This was the 22 item scale, parceled down to 3. For reinvestment, we got it down to 4 for self-focus, and the others 3 each. You see a couple of R's in there. When you're doing item parceling, it's as if you're creating composites, right? So you got to make sure you reverse code items to create composites. Same thing here in SEM. If you're not creating composites, you don't necessarily need to reverse code, but in creating these composites, you just need to make sure that you do. So for example, reinvestment scale, that 4th parcel was 2, 3, and 5, and then the item 7 needed to be reverse coded in order to match the first 3. So that's something to double check when you're going through this, certainly, this process. So anyway, each of these scales was reduced down to either 3 or 4 items, and you see the remainder here. Each of these was 3. And so then we ran our model, and each of these, like I said, so reinvestment had 4 items, everything else had 3. And so I didn't show them here in the diagram because that would clutter things up. That's what I was advised to do for the publication as well. Keep it like this, and then report the factor loadings either in tables or in the text. So that's what I did. This is what it turned out to be. There were some loadings here, and some, in particular, some regression coefficients that came out to be much greater or much less than expected. But the focus here was on the right side of the diagram in particular, so intuitive control with a 0.77 predicting performance under pressure. That was like, okay, that actually formed the foundation of my next study, which was trying to better define intuitive control as this thing where you feel like you're just going to be awesome and you don't know why, you can't explain it, and that leads you to perform well. So it's it's been an odd thing to study in the years since my dissertation, because if you're trying to ask somebody to describe an intuitive feeling, it's like that's kind of not intuitive, right? So it's not a it's been a challenge of measurement, but we can talk about that if you'd like some other time. Meanwhile, you can see some of the coefficients here came out to be higher than others. This is the one where I just left everything in. I didn't walled test drop anything out, at least not in this diagram. But anyway, the whole point of this was to show you the item parceled process to allow us to keep latent variables in here and reduce the number of indicators that each had. This is the one where it was modified, so you see some LM test additions and some walled test subtractions. And the CFI is 0.95. Okay, no wonder it got published. So just some concluding thoughts on item parceling. This is kind of a special scenario here for me. You're not all going to encounter this scenario when you are going through your decision making as far as whether or not to put together an SEM. What was special about this is that I had a couple of scales, in particular sport confidence and reinvestment, that were like really, really long scales, 22 items, 14 items. So we needed to do something about those to collapse them down. Those scales had previously been published, so there was some reason to believe that we could just cut them back. If you have a new scale in your data that you maybe created for the first time, like for example for me, intuitive control was a new scale, so I wanted to try to preserve its the factor analysis of it and report it so that there was some empirical value in there. If you have that in your study, you probably want to keep your latent variable in there and report all the factor loadings of the individual items, because that holds some value. So I would recommend that. And then that's kind of the basis for keeping everything in SEM, which is sort of the plan A. But then if you run into a situation like I did, where I ran out of participants after a certain period of signups, I needed to publish this study, or I needed to finish it for my degree first of all, and then try to publish it. So anyway, plan A would have been for me to run more subjects and then do a full SEM. But again, the sport confidence and reinvestment scales were out of control in terms of number of items. So I would have had to run a ton of participants, I think. So I was like, well, this item parceled solution seems like a nice alternative, because I can cut those back at least. The plan initially was to just cut those back and then leave everything else as is, but once I got going with the item parceling, it made sense to do that with everything, so I did. So again, for you guys, if you have a new scale in your data set, keep it as a latent variable if you can, and if you have the sample size to support it. And then keep everything as latent variables if you can. But if you run into a limitation on sample size or something like that, then you might want to slow down, and then just consider item parceling as an alternative to just compositing everything. If you have a decent sample size like 201 and you're not stuck at like 60 people. If you're stuck at 60 people, well, then you probably want to just make some composites and run a path analysis. So there's no one single recommendation that I will leave you with, but this is, like I've been mentioning, a sort of a compromise between compositing everything versus leaving everything as latent variables.